after the discussion, for you to welcome on the stage EUAN FINLAY from Financial Times. He's going to talk about how to write code that doesn't break so often, and not to worry when you're in production. Please welcome EUAN FINLAY.
Cool, thank you very much. It's really nice being here actually, and thank you very much for the introduction. So, despite this being a technical conference, the scariest production incident that I've been part of in my 4 years at the Financial Times now wasn't actually caused by anything in our technology stack. Back in 2015, the European Central Bank was preparing to make an important announcement, with everyone across the financial industry expecting interest rates to be cut. When major events like this happen, it's common in the media to prepare articles for both sets of outcomes. This is so that we can be ready to publish without needing to write an article from scratch. Sometimes, though, mistakes happen and the wrong information gets published. For example, this was when the BBC accidentally announced the Queen's death on Twitter, which hadn't happened at all. In our case, we were updating a draft article about the ECB holding the interest rates steady, and this was the complete opposite of what everyone was expecting to happen. However, instead of updating the draft, the wrong article was accidentally published live, 10 minutes ahead of the announcement embargo. To make things worse, our systems then automatically published the associated tweet, which went live out to all of our readers. And due to the high level of trust as well that people place in our reporting, everyone who read the article thought that the announcement was surprising, but factually accurate. And the incorrect article caused the exchange rate to spike by 0.4%, which is a really significant shift in the financial markets. This was a huge issue for us at the FT, with some really serious implications. We immediately removed the incorrect article, then published the real announcement, alongside a correction. After that, the exchange rate did drop back down to normal levels. And while there wasn't any long-term damage to the markets, this had a serious impact on our brand and our reputation. There were some extremely stressed people across the editorial, technology and communications departments that morning. It's quite scary to think that a mistake like this can have a serious real-world impact. However, the incident was handled well by the teams involved, and their quick actions went a long way towards mitigating any damage to the business. In response to this as well, we made a number of improvements to the technical side of publishing, as well as our processes. We put measures in place to make it much harder to accidentally publish a draft article. And we also had problems with a false article being cached in various places after we'd taken it down. These days, the legacy services that run our front-end website have entirely been replaced, so this is much less of a worry for us now. I'm a senior integration engineer at the Financial Times. I originally started off in desktop support and then spent some time as a Linux sysadmin. Currently, I lead a team at the FT who support and maintain our back-end content APIs, working with Kubernetes, Docker, and Go microservices. Although we're most famous for the newspaper, we're actually primarily a digital content company these days. Last year was the first time that revenue from our online content overtook our physical paper and our advertising as well. Our content and our website are absolutely critical to our survival. We invest heavily in technology, and we've got many teams working on different areas of the business. At the FT, we're big believers in DevOps practices and empowered engineering teams. We trust them to make the best decisions around technology, architecture, and delivery as well. What that means is that as part of that, our teams fully own, run, and support their services from the very beginning to the end of the product lifecycle. We currently have some open positions in Sofia in London as well, so if you do enjoy my talk, please take a look and feel free to come and chat to me afterwards. But maybe you're part of a team that's been running for a while now. You're proud of the services that you've built and deployed. It's still quite intimidating being told that you're now responsible for dealing with production issues. Or perhaps you're a developer or an engineer that's recently moved to a new company. You've had some time to settle in and you're starting to get familiar with your technology stack, but now you're being asked to go on the on-call voter. So, quick audience participation moment. Hands up if you've been on call or if you are on call right now. Hands up if you've never had to support any production services at all. And hands up if you don't like putting your hands up in the middle of conference talks, because I don't like doing that. I remember what it felt like the first time that I was called out. It was terrifying. I was being asked to fix a service that I knew nothing about. I couldn't find the documentation. I thought it was the worst thing in the world. I was seriously tempted to quit technology entirely and just become a llama farmer. It's almost something like imposter syndrome, I feel, because no matter how good you are or how much experience you have, I suspect that everyone feels something similar the first time that they get called out or have to start handling production incidents. Even now, with the experience that I have, I still get a twinge of fear whenever my phone goes off in the middle of the night. What if it's something that I can't fix? Or what if I'm just not good enough? So the idea behind this talk was to think around what tips and advice I could give so that you're not dreading that phone call or that Slack message of everything is broken. And when I was writing this talk, I was told that it helps to have a bit of a tenuous theme to link everything together. So I thought to myself, who else is quite grumpy like a lot of ops or sysadmin people are? And who else gets woken up at 2 o'clock in the morning? The answer was Ebenezer Scrooge from A Christmas Carol, which actually leads really nicely into a talk structure about dealing with production incidents. Because much like A Christmas Carol, there are preparations that we can make right now to help us the next time that we get called out or have major problems. There are some actions that we should take whenever anything actually breaks. And then there are tasks that we should do afterwards to improve things for next time. So, knowing that things will go wrong at some point, what can we do to plan ahead? Handling incidents is the same as any other skill. It can be learned, it can be taught, and it can be practiced. If the first time that you try to do this is at 2 a.m. without any training, with no plan of action, then it's not going to go very well, and you're going to be really, really stressed. If you're familiar with dealing with your alerts and with what can go wrong, you'll be a lot more relaxed when you do get that call out. So, in order to help with this, get people on your teams to rotate through support regularly, in hours, when everyone else is available to help and support them. It will get everyone on your teams familiar with what can go wrong, the alerts that can go off, the monitoring tools that you have. Does everyone have access to all of those things? You never want that moment of, ooh, I can't access the documentation during the middle of an emergency when the alerts are going off. And on a similar theme as well, alert noise and overload is really, really bad. Every alert should be actionable. Otherwise, you might lose real issues in that noise. Or inversely, you might get called out for no reason. I work with Sarah Wells, who did a very good talk on alert overload, which I definitely recommend checking out. Depending on where you work or what you work on, having an incident response plan might look very different. Maybe your company is large enough to have a first-line team that escalates problems to you that they're unable to fix themselves. Your response plan might be very formal and well-defined across the whole business. Alternatively though, if you're just in a small startup, it might just be a handful of you and your team, and you might just be getting called out by PagerDuty or some other automated equivalent. In that case, perhaps all you need is a quick verbal discussion with your team to set expectations, or have some guidelines jotted down in a Google document somewhere. Either way, you don't want to be wondering what you're meant to be doing when your alerts do start going off. And keep your documentation up to date as well. Nobody likes writing documentation, I think. I know I definitely don't. But you need to have information on what to do when your services break. What it does, where it lives, how it works, they're all really good starting points. Service panic guides or runbooks are important as well. Write those as though it's 2 o'clock in the morning and you've just been woken up and you have the bare minimum that you need to get your service back up and running again afterwards. It's awful trying to fix a system that has no documentation when the only person who knows about it has left the company a few months ago. Once you have these guides, run through them on a regular basis to make sure that they still work and that people are familiar with them. We did this ourselves in fairly spectacular fashion one day when we performed a unscheduled test of our disaster recovery procedures. We were provisioning a new production cluster using Ansible, and we ran our playbook that was meant to create us 5 new instances in Amazon. It turns out that if you're not entirely careful with the way that you write to your playbooks, and you say, give me 5 instances, Ansible will ensure that you have 5 instances in total across your entire production Amazon account. The first that we knew of this was when all of our alerts went off, and I hear a very quiet, oh no, from my friend who was sat next to me at the time. Was it a problem? Yes, absolutely. We had a brief outage while we were working out what was going on. But we did manage to get back up and running again fairly quickly. We failed over to our backup cluster, and as we already had a guide on how to spin everything back up from scratch, it wasn't too long before we were back to normal again. However, we definitely wouldn't have wanted to find out that our disaster recovery guide didn't work at that point in time. As an extension of that as well, actively choose to break things and make sure that your services behave the way that you expect. Do your recovery guides still work? Does your alerting and your monitoring work correctly the way that you're expecting? Chaos Monkey is probably the most well-known example of this, but you can do this manually in a controlled fashion as well. Run DR tests to make sure that you iron out any of these bugs with your processes. We ran a planned disaster recovery test once, disconnecting the network to one of our data centers to make sure that we could recover if it happened to us in a real-world situation. We pulled the plug and the ops dashboard lit up with red lights, which was great. That's exactly what we were expecting. We then moved to step number 2, which was to fail over our systems to the healthy data center. And that was the point where we found out that our failover system didn't actually work if one of the data centers wasn't able to be reached. And that's not really great for a failover system at all. We did manage to get that fixed up fairly quickly though. However, the last time that we ran one of these tests was maybe about almost 3 years ago now. For context, we've been moving away from our physical data centers over the last few years as part of a big cost reduction push. We've migrated a lot of our legacy services to the cloud, replaced them with externally hosted solutions, or we've decommissioned them entirely. However, there's still a number of important services that run out of our 2 physical data centers. So you can probably guess what the next slide is going to be. Because recently we had a live test of exactly what happens when one of our data centers drops off the network. And naturally it happened over a weekend in the middle of August when everyone was on holiday without access to their laptops or the internet. As you can imagine as well, after 2 years since the last test, a lot of the information that we had was out of date. And it turned out that there were actually a lot more important services depending on those data centers than we'd originally expected. One of the useful things that we have at the FT is a chat channel that anyone can join. We use this channel to communicate changes that are in progress, to report potential issues or problems that people are having across the business. As you can imagine, this channel got very busy during this outage, with lots of problems being announced and particularly simple or automated either. It's a fiddly, manual process that involves DNS updates, configuration changes, and service restarts as well. It'd been so long since we'd last done it that we had to hope that the people with the knowledge were actually available, and that they could actually remember what those failover steps were. We did get everything stabilised though, without any major customer impact. Later on, we found that the cause of the problems was actually another customer in this data centre, decommissioning some of their network equipment. And in the process of doing that, they cut the fibre connection that provided internet to 90% of our servers. There's probably not many ways that we could have predicted that happening at that time. And it did take us roughly 5 days for network connectivity to be fully restored, and for all of our services to be back to high availability and running out of both data centres again. Which was really fortunate, because a day later we then had a core network switch fail in the other data centre, so we then had to repeat the exercise again, this time going in the other direction. We were definitely a lot more practiced the second time around. So we should have followed our own advice really. If we'd practiced this more regularly and tested our failover processes, we'd have been a lot quicker, a lot smoother, and we'd have had a much better understanding of the impact and of what needed to happen. But we did still recover without any major business impact, and we learnt a lot about the remaining legacy services that are still important to us. We also uncovered a whole set of issues that we had no idea about, such as a high availability service that just wasn't able to connect to one of our data centers at all. One of our monitoring tools doesn't like it if it can't reliably connect to its monitoring targets. And some of our legacy services run out of memory when you route all the traffic through a single data center. All of those issues are now fixed, or in the process of being fixed. And more importantly, we've learned from that experience and we've used it to improve our legacy failover documentation and processes. So those are some ideas of things that you might want to go away, think about, and perhaps get started on before something goes wrong. But something's happened. Alerts have gone off, and you've been called out and been asked to investigate. What are the first steps that you should take? First of all, take a deep breath, because dealing with incidents is really stressful. But do what you can to remind yourself that it's generally not the end of the world. For most of us, if our website goes down or if our service fails, it's usually not catastrophic in the grand scheme of things. While we use it as a figure of speech, our problems don't usually cause things to literally catch fire or to put people's lives at risk. It's always tempting to immediately jump in as well and then start trying to solve the problem because you've had this adrenaline rush and you need to fix it straight away. But go back to basics first. Treat it the same as anything else that you do at work and get as much information as possible before you start. Generally speaking, no matter what the problem is, there's always a certain set of questions that I will ask myself before digging into a problem further. What's the actual impact? For example, for my team at the FT, we're a content company, so our most critical considerations are, can the journalists publish content? And can customers access our website? A problem preventing the news from going out is a huge issue, and we will immediately pull multiple people into that problem as soon as possible. However, if it's our Jenkins box that alerts that it's running low on disk space on a weekend, I'm probably not likely to care that much, and I'll fix it on Monday. If it's overnight and it doesn't need to be fixed immediately, it's often safer to actually wait until morning when you have a clearer head and more eyes on the fix. Some things to consider with this. So, is it affecting your customers? Is the issue blocking other teams right now? Is there a brand impact? Does it make your company look bad? For example, the issue that I talked about earlier where we published the wrong article, that was definitely something that had to be handled immediately. So, let's assume that it is important and that it does need investigation. What's already been tried? Maybe nothing if you are the first responder. Perhaps First Line have already run through the standard obvious solutions, such as restarting or failing over. Or maybe your teammates have tried some fixes. Get as much information as possible, because getting vague details on this can sometimes hide the actual problem as well. I've restarted it. What's it? Is it the service? Is it the laptop? Is it the internet? I hope they've not restarted the internet. And validate that the problem does actually exist as well, because there are times when you'll have reports like, the website is slow, and that can honestly mean anything from my home Wi-Fi router is broken to there's been another denial of service attack on Dyn and 90% of the internet has now fallen over. Or maybe the monitoring system is actually broken and it started spamming out alerts to everyone. That's happened to us before. So get as much information as you can. It's worth spending just a few minutes to validate that there is definitely an issue before you start jumping in trying to fix things. So let's assume that there is indeed a problem and you need to investigate further. What's the least amount of effort that you can spend to bypass that problem, to work around it, and to get back online? Depending on what your service is, this is often more important and often easier than actually fixing the root cause. For example, can we just fail over? Can we just roll back the release? Or can we just restore a snapshot? If you don't have a simple way to restore your service though, you'll need to investigate, and this will entirely depend on your system architecture and your issue. I'm not going to tell you how to do that because you know that better than I do. But some good starting points that, as a grumpy sysadmin myself, might be, check the logs. Have you checked the disk, CPU, memory traffic? Have you checked the steps in your panic guide? Has there been a new release or a deployment around the time of when these problems started happening? Was there some planned work that was scheduled to start? Or are there any other known outages or issues going on at the same time as well? such as when Dyn broke the internet back in 2016, or when Amazon have had problems in the past where S3 or EC2 have fallen over for entire regions at a time. Let's assume that whatever has gone wrong isn't simple to solve. You've done your investigation, you've tried the obvious solutions, and you're still stuck. That's okay. Call for backup if you can. It's often better to bring other people in and get help quickly, because you can't always fix everything on your own. And that's fine. Having diverse teams is really important for this, because everyone has different experiences and ideas, and they'll often approach problems from completely different angles. Don't be afraid to ask for assistance if you need it. Nobody's going to think any less of you for doing that. In my previous company, we had an air conditioning alert for an office server room that was going off at the weekend. And the tech director at the time, he got an alert from our monitoring system, and he popped in to fix it because he lived quite near the office. However, he couldn't remember the door code to get through the security door, and at this point, most people would have called us to get the new code. Instead, he decided to crawl through the false ceiling of the office to get into the server room. And in case you're not aware, office ceilings aren't designed to support the weight of a person. It gave way, and he fell into the server room, which then caused us even more problems than the air conditioning unit, which was broken, and we had to sort all of this out on Monday. It turns out that wild servers are easily startled, and they don't like having people fall on top of them unexpectedly. They definitely don't like breathing in many years of accumulated ceiling dust either. It didn't look like this, by the way. It looked nothing like that. In his defence, his reasoning was that he didn't want to disturb us on a weekend and call us out. So I can respect that line of thought. But it would have been much better for everyone involved if he had just called us up, asked for help, and then we could have fixed the problem together, without having to replace the ceiling afterwards. So, communication is really important, and it's really irritating if you're trying to use a service or a product, it's not working, and you've got no idea if anyone is investigating it or if they're even aware of the problem at all. Even though everything might be on fire, you still need to communicate with your customers and the business. This is quite difficult when you're actually trying to fix the problem at the same time. So, make someone in charge of being the incident manager. They have to be in charge of handling communication, sending out updates, because it's extremely hard to multitask in normal work, let alone doing a stressful production incident. Give one person the task of updating the business and your customers, and make sure that they provide regular updates. They need to prevent interruptions from senior management, from the people actually trying to fix the problem. Beth Long and Elisa Binet did a really good talk at Velocity this year about the incident command role that they have at New Relic, and I really enjoyed that. I thought it was I definitely recommend checking out the video. If you're like us and you have alerts and notifications in your chat channels as well, you've probably seen things like this before. Alert spam makes the channel impossible to use for trying to discuss and solve the issue. So spin up a new channel or group specifically for this incident. This comes back to communication as well. If you have multiple people investigating or fixing a problem, you need somewhere that they can communicate without being interrupted. This is especially true if there are people from multiple teams, areas of the business, or even possibly different companies. It helps a lot with having an incident timeline later on, because you can go back and see who was doing what and when. If you've ever tried to fix something with multiple people, then it often ends up a lot like this. So having this central place to talk really helps with coordination. Make sure that the people share what they're doing, changing, and investigating. Because the last thing that you want is, oh, you were in the middle of rolling back the database, but I've just changed the network settings, and now it's dropped out and your database is fully corrupted. You don't want that to happen. This is an example of one of our temporary incident channels. And as engineers trying to fix the problem, we're discussing the issue, we're sharing graphs and logs and metrics, and announcing any changes or tests that we're trying to implement. I've mentioned communication once already, but it is so important. Provide high-level updates every half an hour or 15 minutes, whatever your timescale is, just to let people know that you're still working on it. Because there's nothing worse than being told, oh, someone's looking into that, and then you don't hear anything for like an hour or 2 hours. And you wonder, is it fixed now? Are they still investigating? Have they just gone for lunch? Who knows? And that does lead into the next point as well, which is when you're tired and you're extremely stressed, as you will be, you will make mistakes. So make sure that people on your team take breaks, especially if the problem is long running. It's really hard to make yourself take 15 minutes to go and get a coffee, to go for a walk while things are still broken, because you feel obligated to stay until the whole problem is solved. But if you don't do this, you'll be less effective. You'll miss obvious things. Maybe you'll even make the problem worse. For long-running incidents, that might involve rotating on shifts, or in larger companies, perhaps it involves handing off to another team. The longest running production incident that I've been part of in the content team was when our European production cluster started failing due to CPU load at around 5 PM on a Thursday, just as everyone was about to start going home. There wasn't any increase in traffic, so we spent some time trying to identify the root cause of the issue, with very little success. Given that our US cluster was healthy, we decided to fail all of our traffic to the US, at which point the US then started failing as well. We continued to spend several hours trying to identify the problem and attempting to get into a state where we can serve any kind of traffic at all. And we were swearing quite a lot at this point, as you can imagine. Because by this point, it's now around 10 PM. The entire team is completely exhausted and we're struggling for ideas. Eventually, it took our Director of Engineering to suggest routing our traffic through our staging environment, manually editing our configuration files to pull data from our old legacy platform, which we were actually migrating away from, and fortunately, we hadn't decommissioned yet. It was roughly around midnight before we managed to get to a point where we were serving stable traffic, but in a very roundabout way. We all went home, and then we continued our investigations the next day. Eventually, we realised that the root cause was an update to a database query that made it extremely slow, and that caused an overload on our databases, and then eventually knock-on effect on the cluster and caused it to collapse. Fortunately as well, the FT front-end team are rather good, and they failed gracefully in this situation, even though that our back-end APIs were extremely unreliable. There was zero end-user downtime, but we did serve stale content for several hours. This would have been a huge problem in a breaking news situation, but fortunately for us, it all worked out in the end. So, there's some hopefully useful tips around how you might want to deal with incidents in progress. But what do you need to do once the dust has settled and you're back online? Take some time, first of all, for your own mental health. This is really, really important. Incidents are extremely stressful, and if you've been working all day yesterday and then through the night, you need to take time to recover, otherwise you're going to burn out the next day. Emma Button suggested using the term learning review instead of post-mortem as well, and I quite like that. Either way, whatever you decide to call this, it's an opportunity to discuss the incident with everyone, especially if the incident had serious impact or had multiple people involved. The objective isn't to point fingers and to assign blame, but it's to discuss what worked, what didn't, and what can be improved for next time as well. Make sure that you do this soon after the incident is resolved, because if you leave it too long, everyone will forget things and they'll move on to other work. And again, while I don't like writing documentation, incident reports are really important and they're extremely valuable as well. This is where having a timeline comes in handy. Because depending on where you work, incident reports might be required and be very formal. You might have to make them public and share them with your external customers. But even if that's not true and you don't have to do that, it's worth having them internally for your own team, so that you've got a record of previous incidents that you can refer back to later. There's nothing worse than running into a production problem and your friend says, "Oh yeah, it's exactly like that time when this happened last year," and then no one can remember how to fix it. So, make sure that you write up what happened and what the solution was. A really good example of an incident report was from when GitLab had a fairly serious outage back at the start of 2017. To briefly summarise, GitLab were investigating a load issue on their production database. There were a number of unfortunate events that they ran into that then compounded the original problem that they were having. and eventually it led to an engineer accidentally deleting production data. To make things worse, they then found that their database backups had been failing silently for some time, which made it a lot harder for them to recover. I've been in similar situations myself, but not at the scale of that, and I know that at the time, I just wanted to crawl into a hole and just hide forever. What really impressed a lot of people though, myself included, was the way in which they handled the outage, because they released a very open, very honest incident report to the public, with a detailed timeline of what happened and why. They also made their disaster recovery process completely open to everyone, which is really unusual. They had a public Google Doc that they used to keep track of their progress, and they also live streamed what they were doing on YouTube. I'm not suggesting that everyone should do this, because I'm not sure that a live stream would have a good mental impact on the engineers who were trying to fix the problem at the time. But it did show that GitLab were committed to keeping their customers up to date with the status of the recovery. Finally, they identified a number of improvements and fixes to ensure that this problem could never happen again. Again, these were shared publicly as issues on their site, so that everyone could see their progress and their status. I definitely recommend checking out the full report, because it's a really interesting and, honestly, it's quite scary read. This is the most important part of the post-incident process, though, because it encompasses multiple things, and not all of them might be technical or code-related. Nobody's response plans are perfect when they start out, and you should improve them as you go. Maybe your call-out or escalation processes don't work very well, and they need to be tweaked and changed. Perhaps the documentation was incomplete, and that needs to be updated as well. Or perhaps there's some obvious bug fixes that could mean that this never would have been an issue in the first place. Once you've identified them though, make sure that they do get done. Because if you leave it too long, people will forget the details and they will move on to other work. I'll briefly mention GitHub's incident report as well from their outage last month. This was released a couple of weeks back. And again, it's very well written and very interesting, so I definitely recommend checking it out. I'll put on Twitter all the links and stuff later on as well, so don't worry too much if you don't read the link right now. We had an outage at a previous company that I used to work at, where a business analyst ran some scripts against a production database, thinking they were connected to pre-production. The production database name was prod, which is pretty much what you'd expect. But the pre-production database was named pprod, and that's exactly one character difference from the production database name. While I didn't name it, the top of our list of actions was to rename that database. Don't give databases really similar names in future, and to restrict access to production as well, so that people can't accidentally connect without realizing what they're doing and where they are. So that's pretty much everything that I wanted to talk about today. I hope you've found it interesting and useful. To sum up though, problems and outages are just another part of what we deal with in technology. It's how we plan for them, it's how we respond to them, and it's how we improve things afterwards that really makes the difference. For any of you who are new to supporting, I hope that I've not completely scared you off. And hopefully you've got some ideas of things that you might want to go away and do after this to make your lives easier when something does eventually go wrong. And if you do need to go on call, you'll have some plans in place to cope, so it won't be quite as intimidating. Thank you very much. Hello. If we have time, I'm more than happy to take questions. And if you don't want to ask a question, I will be floating around the conference for the next couple of days, so please do feel free to come and have a chat with me. You're always more than welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Cool. All good? Anyone? Oh, no questions. Okay, brilliant. In that case, no questions. Bye!